In the early decades of the 19th century, when Kentucky was still a wild frontier caught between progress and wilderness, whispers began to circulate in hushed tones across the small towns that dotted its valleys. The hills themselves seemed to hold secrets. Silent witnesses to lives lived on the edge of law and civility. Among these rumors, one story refused to die: the tale of a family secluded deep in the Appalachian ridges, whose hunger turned inward toward their own kind. It was said that they did not simply live off the land, they devoured it, and perhaps each other. By the year 1820, these whispers had grown into a chilling legend that the locals dared not mention by name after dusk: the Cannibal clan that haunted the hills. Travelers passing through Kentucky's rugged trails often vanished without explanation. Some were traders, some migrants searching for new farmland, others wanderers chasing fortune in the frontier. Their absence was first blamed on the usual dangers of the time: wolves, bears, bandits, even the unforgiving landscape itself. Yet the pattern grew too distinct, too deliberate. Wagons were discovered abandoned, with horses wandering free. Campfires were found still smoking, their owners gone. And in the darkness of the Kentucky backwoods, fragments of bones gnawed, broken, and discarded began to surface. The people of the region spoke cautiously, rarely in public, as if the act of discussing the clan might draw their attention. Farmers warned their children never to stray too far, not just for fear of wild animals, but for something more cunning. The hills had eyes, they said, and once those eyes fell upon you, there would be no return. Yet no one could name this family openly. They were ghosts of flesh and blood, hidden in cabins built from rotting timber, blending with the forest like shadows. This was not a time when law enforcement could reach every hollow. The state was young, its resources limited, its sheriffs and marshals spread thin across vast and difficult terrain. Justice, when it came at all, was slow, uncertain, and often carried out by the hands of neighbors rather than courts. This void created the perfect shelter for those who wished to live outside morality. The Cannibal clan, if they truly existed, thrived in this silence, in the gaps between society and wilderness. What little is remembered comes not from official records but from fragments, entries in private journals, faded reports in regional newspapers, and the oral history of families who survived the frontier. Some claim the clan were outcasts, descendants of settlers who had broken away from nearby communities, bound together by blood and secrecy. Others believed they were an isolated sect, practicing rites that had no place in civilized faith, their hunger both spiritual and physical. And still others whispered something darker, that starvation had once driven them to a single unthinkable act, and from that moment, the line between survival and desire was forever blurred. Picture the hills in the winter of 1820. Snow thick. Upon the ground, the trees skeletal in their barrenness, the wind carrying a low moan through the valleys. A traveler moves cautiously along the narrow path, the kind carved by hooves and wagon wheels, but barely maintained. His lantern swings with each step, a weak circle of light in the vast darkness. Somewhere above, unseen, a figure watches. Perhaps two, perhaps three. They know the terrain. They know the silence. By the time the traveler hears the crack of a branch, it is too late. What happens next is speculation, retold in whispers. But the evidence always surfaced weeks later. Bones charred by fire, clothing shredded and buried shallow, pieces of a life consumed in both flesh and memory. Those who lived near the foothills swore they heard screams carried by the wind, though none dared to follow them. Dogs would growl at the tree line, refusing to enter, as if some ancient instinct warned them of what lurked beyond. Even in daylight, the hills seemed heavier there, the air denser, as though nature itself recoiled. Hunters who ventured too far sometimes never returned. Their rifles were found leaning against trees, as if carefully placed. Their owners vanished into thin air. And always, behind the speculation, was the same phrase spoken under breath: "The clan has fed again." To modern ears, such stories may sound like folklore, the kind of rural legend meant to frighten children or caution travelers. Yet in the fragile social order of early 19th century Kentucky, where records were scarce and survival precarious, these stories carried weight. Fear-shaped behavior, guided where people settled, even influenced trade routes. Whether myth or truth, the Cannibal clan left a mark not just on the hills, but on the imagination of a community that could not fully explain the disappearances. And so the story survives, lodged between history and nightmare. The hills of Kentucky have long since been mapped and tamed, their forests cut back, their valleys filled with farms and towns. But when one looks deep enough into the archives, when one listens closely to the testimonies preserved by generations, the whispers grow louder. A family once lived here, hidden among the trees, bound by hunger and silence. They did not merely haunt the hills, they became them, and 2 centuries later, their shadow has never fully disappeared. To understand how such a story could take root in the hills of Kentucky in the year 1820, we must first step back and consider the fragile world in which it unfolded. America was young, barely 4 decades removed from its Declaration of Independence, and the frontier was both a promise and a peril. Kentucky had joined the Union in 1792, but the early 19th century was still marked by isolation, poverty, and the daily struggle for survival. Life here was defined less by the ideals of the new republic than by the raw reality of wilderness pressing against the edges of settlement. The land itself shaped the people. Kentucky was carved by ridges and valleys, its Appalachian foothills, dense with oak and hickory, its hollows deep and often inaccessible. Travel was slow, and communities developed in pockets, often cut off from one another for weeks at a time. Roads, where they existed, were muddy tracks more suited for horses than wagons. Rivers were the lifelines of commerce, yet they too could be treacherous in floods or droughts. For many families, the hills provided shelter and resources, but also fostered a sense of isolation that could harden into suspicion and secrecy. Socially, Kentucky was a meeting ground of cultures. Scots-Irish settlers brought with them a fierce independence and traditions of folk belief that mingled with the realities of frontier life. African Americans, both enslaved and free, formed a growing population in towns and on farms, carrying their own cultural traditions and facing the brutal restrictions of slavery. Native American groups, though increasingly displaced by expansion, still lingered in memory and in fear, their former presence often invoked in stories to explain the unexplained. This mix created a volatile cultural landscape where rumor and superstition could thrive as readily as corn and tobacco. Life was precarious. Disease swept through communities with little warning and limited remedies. Infant mortality was high, and few families escaped the sting of early death. Famine was less common than in Europe, but hunger was no stranger, particularly in harsh winters when hunting failed and harvests ran thin. In such conditions, stories of desperation families pushed to unthinkable acts to survive were not dismissed lightly. They reflected real anxieties, born of a life where survival often demanded choices that civilized society would rather not contemplate. The economy of Kentucky was both promising and uneven. Wealthier families cultivated large farms, some with enslaved labor, producing hemp, tobacco, and livestock for trade. But most settlers lived modestly, scratching a living from small plots of land, raising a few animals, and relying heavily on barter. Cash was scarce, and self-reliance was more necessity than virtue. Communities relied on one another for shared labor during harvests and for protection against bandits or wild animals. Yet this interdependence also carried a sharp edge. Those who did not conform, who lived too far from town or shunned neighbors, were often viewed with suspicion. It was in this atmosphere that tales of dangerous families emerged. The frontier produced both heroes and outlaws, both celebrated pioneers and whispered criminals. To live beyond the reach of the church, the school, or the town hall was to invite speculation. Families who settled too deep into the hills, who avoided markets or declined to worship, became fertile ground for rumors. Perhaps they were simply eccentric, scarred by loss, or protective of their privacy. But to neighbors already attuned to danger, their isolation suggested darker motives. The hills themselves played a role in shaping these perceptions. Appalachia was and remains a region where folklore carries weight. Stories of witches, haints, and cursed lands were woven into the fabric of daily life. Children were raised on tales of creatures that lurked just beyond the tree line, and adults traded warnings of places best avoided. When livestock disappeared or a traveler failed to arrive, these superstitions offered explanations. In such a cultural landscape, the leap from strange family to cannibal clan was not so far. The year 1820 specifically was a moment of tension in Kentucky's development. The state was growing rapidly. Its population had surged to nearly 600,000 by that time, but infrastructure lagged behind. Political debates raged about slavery, land rights, and state banking systems. Yet for many ordinary people, survival still depended on the yield of a cornfield or the hunt in the forest. Law enforcement was minimal outside larger towns like Lexington or Louisville. In rural counties, sheriffs were elected but poorly funded, and courts met sporadically. Vigilante justice was common, with neighbors taking matters into their own hands when crimes occurred. Against this backdrop, rumors of a murderous or cannibalistic family could persist for years without definitive proof, because few officials had the resources or the will to investigate deeply. It is also worth noting that the culture of storytelling was a lifeline in itself. With few books, newspapers arriving sporadically, and isolation pressing in, oral tales became entertainment, warning, and community memory. Around firesides and in taverns, travelers' tales blended with local gossip, often gaining sinister details with each retelling. A single disappearance could, in the retelling, become a pattern of murders. A strange-looking bone in the woods could transform into evidence of cannibalism. For modern historians, separating fact from folklore is nearly impossible. But for the people of 1820 Kentucky, the difference mattered less. What mattered was the caution these stories inspired. From a cultural and psychological perspective, tales of cannibalism carried particular weight because they inverted the very foundation of community. On the frontier, neighbors depended on one another for survival. To imagine a family who not only rejected this bond but preyed upon travelers and neighbors was to imagine the ultimate betrayal. Cannibalism was more than murder. It was an annihilation of trust, of humanity itself. In this sense, whether true or not, the story of the cannibal clan symbolized the deepest fears of a society struggling to define civilization against the wilderness. Archaeological and historical records from Appalachia in this era support the idea that some families did indeed vanish from records, appearing briefly in censuses only to disappear a decade later. Land was abandoned, cabins left to rot, and graves sometimes unmarked. To communities struggling to explain these absences, the imagination filled gaps with sinister explanations. And while there is no definitive proof of a Kentucky clan in 1820 who survived by consuming others, the persistence of the legend suggests that people believed it possible, perhaps even likely. Thus, when we speak of the cannibal clan that haunted the hills, we are not merely recounting a tale of monsters. We are entering into the mindset of a time when isolation bred fear, when survival pressed people to their limits, and when the boundaries between folklore and fact were paper thin. The Kentucky hills of 1820 were not just a backdrop for this legend, they were its womb, nurturing whispers that would echo long after the cabins had rotted away and the bones had turned to dust. The first account that emerged came from a trader traveling the route between Lexington and the smaller frontier settlements further east. He was a man known to locals, often carrying bolts of cloth, iron tools, and precious salt through the rugged terrain. In the winter of 1820, he set out with a pack mule and a modest wagon, expected to return within 2 weeks. When he failed to arrive, neighbors at first assumed delays, for snow often slowed progress. Yet when weeks stretched into months, worry hardened into certainty. A search party followed his intended path, finding the wagon splintered by the roadside, the mule still tethered but weakened from neglect. The man himself was gone. In the mud nearby were prints' bare feet, small and numerous, circling like wolves around prey. Among the debris lay bones that did not belong to livestock. The discovery was never formally recorded, but passed along in whispers. each retelling darker than the last. Not long after, a family moving westward vanished in the same stretch of hills. They had been seen at a tavern days earlier, a couple with 2 older sons, their wagon laden with belongings, speaking of Missouri lands that promised opportunity. They never reached their destination. Their horses were later found grazing wild near a creek bed, their tack stripped. On the bank, searchers found remnants of a fire, charred wood, and, hidden among ashes, a fragment of something unmistakably human, a jawbone, teeth intact. For days the story spread like contagion, until fear convinced many to avoid the route entirely. The accounts multiplied. Hunters spoke of being tracked, their kills stolen before they could carry them home. One claimed he returned to find his deer carcass dragged away, footprints in the mud revealing not animals but people, moving barefoot and swift through the trees. He never hunted those hills again. Another told of hearing cries at night, voices, half human, half animal, echoing through the ravines. He swore the sound was neither wolf nor man, but something in between, and though he carried his rifle, he dared not follow. By spring, whispers grew more precise. It was said a family lived, deep in a hollow cabin, its roof sagging, its windows boarded. No one knew how many they numbered. Some spoke of 7, others of a dozen. But always they were described as gaunt, with hollow eyes, their skin pale as though the sun had not touched them in years. Strangers who passed too near were said to disappear, dragged into the woods, never to be seen again. It was not only hunger that drove them, the stories insisted, but ritual. Some spoke of fires that burned too brightly in the night, of shapes moving in circles around them, chanting low, until the sound dissolved into silence. A preacher traveling through the region later wrote in his diary of a night he spent with a local farmer. After supper, the farmer warned him to leave at first light and not linger. When pressed, the man admitted that his neighbor's daughter had vanished months earlier, taken while fetching water from the creek. The family had searched desperately, but all they found was a trail of bare footprints leading toward the hills. The girl was never recovered. The preacher wrote that the farmer wept openly as he told the story, but his final words were colder still. Better not to find her. Better she be gone to the Lord than kept by them. Another incident shook the nearby community when 2 boys stumbled upon a clearing while hunting squirrels. At its center stood a crude pit, half filled with water, its edges blackened by soot. Floating on the surface was something they could not mistake. Bones stripped clean, some cracked open as if for marrow. The boys fled and refused to return, and their father, after hearing their account, gathered neighbors to investigate. When they reached the clearing, they found it deserted, the pit still there but emptied of its contents, as though someone had taken care to remove the evidence. From that day forward, no child of that settlement was allowed to roam beyond the edge of the fields. As fear spread, some suggested organized action raids, searches, even torches to burn out the hollow. Yet most hesitated. The hills were treacherous, their paths known only to those born within them. To chase shadows was to risk ambush, and few were willing to risk their lives when law offered no protection. Instead, people adapted. They traveled in larger groups, avoided night journeys, and carried weapons openly. Some families relocated altogether, abandoning fertile land rather than live so near the legend. One story that persisted with unsettling detail was that of a peddler from Virginia. He had been known to sleep in barns or outbuildings, trading trinkets and remedies for food or coin. When he failed to reappear in towns where he often sold, people assumed he had moved on. Months later, a trapper swore he found the man's satchel in the hills, its contents scattered, the leather gnawed as though chewed by teeth. With it were scraps of cloth, blood-stained and stiff, caught on the low branches of a cedar. No body was ever found, but the implication was clear. The trapper never returned to that stretch of woods, telling others, "The hills take what they want." Perhaps the most haunting account came from a woman who survived. She had been traveling with her husband, seeking work in a neighboring county. As dusk fell, they lost their way among the ridges. From the trees emerged figures, gaunt and silent, their eyes catching the faint light of the fire the couple had built. Before they could react, the figures surged forward. The woman recalled being struck from behind, her husband dragged screaming into the darkness. She herself was bound and carried to a cabin where shadows moved in the flicker of firelight. She remembered the smell most vividly: rot, smoke, and iron. Somehow, while her captors were distracted, she slipped her bonds and fled into the night, stumbling blindly until she reached a farm at dawn. Her story was so horrific that some dismissed it as delirium, but others believed every word, for her hair had turned nearly white within days. Her husband was never found. Through these accounts, a pattern emerged. The clan preyed on the vulnerable. Travelers alone, small families, hunters who strayed too far. They struck swiftly, vanished into the terrain, and left behind just enough evidence to confirm the worst. Whether the tales were exaggerated or true, they fed the growing conviction that something unnatural haunted the hills. By the year's end, the region was marked on maps not with ink but with silence, a place avoided, unnamed, its boundaries defined only by fear. Even today, scholars debate whether such a clan truly existed or whether the legend was an amalgamation of isolated crimes, accidents, and folklore woven together. Yet the details, repeated across independent accounts, suggest something more than simple imagination. The bare footprints, the gnawed bones, the vanished wagons, they formed a mosaic of horror that even time could not erase. For the people of the 1820 Kentucky, the Cannibal clan was not a story. It was a presence, unseen but undeniable, shaping how they lived, traveled, and feared. The hills of Kentucky in 1820 were already a place where life pressed hard on its people. But the rumors of the clan brought a new kind of pressure, one that was invisible, suffocating, and always present. The response of the community was not simple. It was a blend of fear, suspicion, religious interpretation, and practical adaptation. People did not live with these whispers as though they were mere stories. They lived with them as if the clan were watching from the edge of the tree line, unseen but waiting. Families closest to the hollows where disappearances were said to occur carried the heaviest burden. Parents forbade their children to fetch water. Alone, and fields near the forest grew wild for lack of tending. At night, households doubled their locks, though the wood of their cabins was flimsy defense against whatever they imagined lurked beyond. Many stopped traveling at dusk, and few dared to make the journey without company. The rhythm of daily life shifted in quiet but significant ways, shaped less by fact than by fear. Neighbors whispered suspicions about those who lived too far from town, especially families who were reclusive, eccentric, or poor. Isolation itself became incriminating. A man who hunted alone, a woman who rarely attended church, a household that avoided markets, all became targets of sideward glances and whispered speculation. Though no one could prove who the Cannibal clan truly was, suspicion was enough to tarnish reputations. Fear fractured trust, and where once communities had relied on one another, now shadows of doubt lingered. Churches offered their own interpretations. For preachers, the stories of the clan became sermons, warnings of what happened when people turned away from God and fell into savagery. Cannibalism was cast not just as a crime, but as the ultimate sin, a corruption of humanity itself. Ministers spoke of the hills as cursed ground, of the clan as souls possessed or condemned. Congregations listened in silence, and though such words offered a frame for the terror, they also deepened the sense that what haunted the hills was beyond the reach of ordinary justice. Doctors, though few and often poorly trained by modern standards, struggled to address the whispers in their own way. Some argued that starvation could drive any family to madness, that cannibalism was not evil but desperation. Others dismissed the accounts as hysteria, symptoms of isolation and stress. But even they could not deny the disappearances, the bones that surfaced, or the survivors' stories. Their skepticism mattered little against the weight of communal fear. Local newspapers occasionally carried brief mentions, though carefully worded. Reports spoke of disturbances in the eastern counties or unaccounted travelers, but rarely dared to print the word cannibal. Editors understood that to commit such claims to ink was to either fan panic or open themselves to ridicule. Yet between the lines, readers saw enough to confirm what they already whispered among themselves. Lawmen, stretched thin across the state, had little to offer. Sheriffs in rural counties were often a single man with no deputies, tasked with covering vast territory. They lacked both manpower and evidence. When asked to investigate, most shrugged, citing the dangers of the terrain and the unreliability of rumor. Some privately admitted they believed the stories, but they also knew they were powerless against a family that could vanish into the hills as quickly as the wind. Justice, in these matters, was left to time or to the people themselves. Vigilante groups did form, though rarely with lasting effect. Small bands of men armed with rifles ventured into the woods, determined to find the clan. They returned with stories of strange campsites, bones scattered in fire pits, or cabins abandoned in haste. Yet no living members were captured, and many believed the clan knew the terrain too well, slipping away long before intruders arrived. Over time, the attempts dwindled, not from lack of anger but from exhaustion. The hills swallowed both hunters and hunted, and the people resigned themselves to avoidance rather than confrontation. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Fear seeped into dreams, shaping nightmares of pursuit, of being dragged into the forest by unseen hands. Mothers told children stories not only of wolves or bears, but of human predators, warning them that silence in the woods was not safety, but danger. Over time, the clan became less a specific family and more a symbol, a reminder of how thin the line was between civilization and savagery, between neighbor and predator. For outsiders passing through, the reaction was often disbelief. Travelers laughed at the tales until they walked the roads themselves, hearing the silence of the woods, seeing the way locals locked their doors at sundown. Some left quickly, unnerved by the atmosphere, while others stayed only long enough to write about it in letters or diaries, spreading the legend beyond Kentucky's borders. In this way, the clan's influence grew not only in the hills, but in the imagination of the nation, whispered in distant taverns as proof that the frontier was as dangerous in spirit as it was in body. As decades passed, the story did not fade. It became part of the folklore, woven into family histories, told in tones of both warning and pride. To say one lived near the haunted hills was to claim a certain resilience, to have survived in spite of the danger. Yet, behind the bravado lingered unease. For every story of survival, there were gaps in genealogies, names spoken once and then never again, suggesting that not all families escaped untouched. In the broader culture of the 1820s, the reactions reveal much about how people understood crime, fear, and survival. With limited science, little law enforcement, and heavy reliance on oral tradition, communities leaned on belief in God, in evil, in curses, and in their own fragile capacity to endure. Whether or not the clan truly existed mattered less than the fact that people lived as though they did. And in that sense, the reaction of society was itself a survival strategy, a way of adapting to the unknown by shaping fear into story. The winter of 1820 was remembered as cruel. Snow fell early in the Kentucky hills, covering the forests with a silence that felt deeper than usual. Crops had failed in several counties, and families huddled in cabins with dwindling supplies. It was in this season, when hunger pressed hardest, that the clan's presence was felt most sharply. Travelers spoke of strange shapes glimpsed between the trees, figures moving with a swiftness unnatural for the deep snow. Hunters found the lie, tracks of bare feet where none should have been, winding through the hollows, circling their camps at night. At first, these stories were dismissed as fear magnified by cold and exhaustion. But then came the disappearances. A tanner from Lexington vanished on the road east, his wagon later found overturned, the horses gone, the snow stained dark. A preacher traveling to baptize a child in a remote settlement never arrived. A family, who had taken to the hills for logging work, simply failed to return, their cabin later discovered empty, the hearth cold, food left on the table as if abandoned in haste. Each incident added weight to the whispers, and the whispers grew until they pressed on every conversation. One night, a farmer named Elias Carter awoke to the sound of scratching against his cabin wall. Thinking it was an animal, he reached for his rifle, only to hear a low whistle. human but strange, as though mimicking a bird. When he stepped outside, lantern in hand, he found the snow around his cabin marked with footprints, circling, overlapping. Dozens of them. Some were small, like those of children. He fired into the trees and the woods fell silent. By morning, the tracks led away into the hills, vanishing where the snow deepened. Carter abandoned his farm the next day, leaving his land behind. The breaking point came with the discovery of a campsite deep in the forest. A group of loggers stumbled upon it while searching for timber. They found bones scattered around a pit, cracked open as if for marrow, the fire still smoldering. Among the remains were possessions: a woman's shawl, a child's toy carved from wood, and a man's boots with the soles worn thin. Panic rippled through the settlement when word spread. No longer rumor, no longer distant, the clan's hand had been revealed, undeniable and near. In response, the largest vigilante force yet assembled. Nearly 30 men armed themselves with muskets, axes, and lanterns, determined to root out the family. They set out at dusk, moving by moonlight, their breath visible in the frozen air. The forest swallowed them quickly, and for hours they pressed deeper into the hollows, guided by silence and the memory of tracks. Then, in the stillness, came the sound. A baby crying, thin and sharp, carried through the trees. Some men froze, certain it was a trick. Others pushed forward, lanterns swinging, until they found a crude shelter built from branches and hides. Inside were scraps of food, gnawed bones, and bedding that smelled of smoke and sweat. Yet no people remained. The cry had ceased as suddenly as it began. Only the fire's ashes glowed faintly. The men pressed on, unease thickening. Hours later, they reached a ravine where the snow was broken by signs of struggle. Blood streaked the ground, leading toward a cave mouth half hidden by brush. Here, the air was rank with the smell of rot. Some urged retreat, warning that to enter was madness. Others, hardened by grief for neighbors lost, demanded they continue. In the end, rage won over caution, and they stepped inside. The cave was narrow, twisting, lit only by lantern flame. Shadows moved like figures against the walls. Bones littered the ground, arranged in piles, some fresh, others yellowed with age. Skins were stretched against the rock as though tanned. And deeper still, the men found them, the clan, crouched in the darkness, eyes glinting in the light. Descriptions of what followed differ, passed down in fragments. Some accounts speak of a wild struggle, of muskets fired in close quarters, of screams that echoed until they seemed to come from the stone itself. Others claim the clan did not fight with weapons but with teeth, clawing and biting in frenzy. In every telling, the horror lay not only in the violence but in the faces human, unmistakably human, yet twisted by hunger into something beyond recognition. The vigilantes emerged hours later, shaken, some wounded, others silent. They said the clan scattered into the woods, vanishing into the night. A few bodies were left behind, but many believed most escaped, carried deeper into the wilderness where no man would follow. When the survivors returned to the settlement, they were pale, their clothes torn, and though they had confronted the monsters of the hills, their victory was uncertain. The fear did not end. That winter became known as the season of the hollow cries. Families swore they still heard them at night, the sound of children wailing in the distance, the whistle of hunters who never revealed themselves. Travelers continued to vanish. And though the vigilantes claimed they had broken the clan, the silence of the woods suggested otherwise. What terrified people most was not only the violence but the thought of endurance. To kill a man was to end a threat, but the clan seemed less like individuals and more like a sickness, one that could spread in silence, hiding behind every cabin door. Mothers whispered warnings to children. Never answer a cry in the woods. Never follow footprints into the snow. Never forget that hunger can twist people into beasts. The climax of the story was not just the confrontation in the cave, but what followed. A community left staring into the dark hills, knowing they had glimpsed something that would never fully die. Fear lingered like a shadow, passed from parent to child, from one generation to the next. The clan had haunted the hills, but now in truth they haunted the people as well. When the winter of 1820 finally loosened its grip, the hills of Kentucky emerged scarred, both in the land and in the memory of its people. Crops were replanted, cabins repaired, and travelers began once again to move through the mountain passes. Outwardly, life returned to rhythm. Yet beneath the surface, the silence of the hills carried a weight that could not be shaken. The stories of the clan refused to fade. For some, they were proof that desperation could drive human beings into darkness more terrifying than any wild beast. For others, they became almost mythic, a cautionary tale whispered to children as warning. Never wander too far, never trust a cry in the woods, never ignore the power of hunger. Generations later, those warnings still lingered, embedded in local folklore, retold beside hearths long after the names of the victims were forgotten. The few physical traces of the clan disappeared with time. The bones scattered in caves crumbled to dust. The crude shelters collapsed back into the forest floor. Some claim to have found remnants: a rusted knife, a patch of hide stretched across stone, but proof was always elusive. Historians, when they tried to separate fact from fear, often found themselves caught in the same fog as the settlers. Were the clan a single family driven mad by isolation, or had their story been amplified by the paranoia of a starving community? Were the cries in the night truly human, or echoes of animals misheard by men desperate for explanations? Psychologists looking back at the case suggested that famine can alter perception as much as it alters appetite. The mind, deprived and fearful, finds patterns where none exist, gives shape to every shadow. In such conditions, rumor becomes indistinguishable from reality, and fear itself takes on a body. But even this analysis does not fully explain the footprints in the snow, the missing travelers, or the bones cracked open in the fire. Others proposed that the clan never truly perished. The vigilantes had struck, yes, but the wilderness was vast. Families could vanish into its depths and emerge miles away, sustained by the very acts that made them monstrous. If they scattered, who is to say their bloodline did not endure, hidden, in remote hollows, emerging only when need drove them once again to the edge of humanity? In the absence of closure, speculation thrived. By the late 19th century, journalists occasionally revived the tale, writing sensational accounts of the cannibals of Kentucky, often mixing fact with exaggeration. Some placed the events decades earlier or later. Others gave the clan names or invented rituals. With every retelling, the story shifted, mutating like the echoes in the hills themselves. Yet at the core, one detail remained unchanged: the fear that, once loosed, the hunger of man could never be fully contained. Today, historians file the tale alongside other unsettling fragments of frontier life. The early American wilderness was filled with isolation, famine, and violence, and in such conditions, survival often blurred into savagery. Whether the cannibal clan was a family gone feral, a legend birthed from hunger, or some uneasy mix of both, it reflects a truth the settlers knew well: that civilization is only a thin line drawn against the wilderness, and when tested, it can break. As dusk settles on those Kentucky hills, hikers sometimes claim they still feel watched. The forest, thick and old, muffles sound so that a twig snapping behind you seems closer than it is. On quiet nights, some say they hear it again, a child's cry, distant and hollow, carried through the trees. Most dismiss it as imagination, or the call of an animal mistaken for something more. But for those who know the story, the sound is never innocent. The epilogue to this dark chapter is not resolution, but silence, the silence of history that swallows evidence, leaving behind only whispers. And perhaps that is the most fitting end. For the people of 1820, the horror was not in proof, but in possibility. The hills themselves became a mirror, reflecting both the wilderness outside and the wilderness within. What remains is a question, as chilling now as it was then. If pressed by hunger, by cold, by despair, how far could we be driven? The hills of Kentucky never answered. They only kept their secrets, locked in the stone and snow, whispering still to those who dare to listen.